Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you are listening to The Sounds of Film. And I'm very excited to have on the phone with us right now director Julie Cohen. She's known for lots of different films that she's made through the years, including American Veteran and The Sturgeon Queen. She's a three-time Emmy winner from New York, and she's the founder of Better Than Fiction Productions. But today we're going to be talking about her hit film, RBG. It's a documentary that everyone's talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. And it's an amazing film that has so much interesting information in it. Julie, thank you so much for joining us on The Sounds of Film today.
Sure, it's great to be here.
Oh, this is some film, and you must be so excited. Is it true that this film is one of Magnolia's most successful films of all time?
Well, you're starting me out on a braggy note, but we are Magnolia's most successful film of all time, as of about a week ago, in their 17-year history. We're their top film of any genre.
That is amazing. Did you have any sense when you were setting out to make this film that was even possible?
You know, when you start making a film, I don't think you're just trying to kind of put one foot in front of the other and do one step at a time. We certainly thought that because of the huge interest in Justice Ginsburg, that this was a project that had some commercial potential, but, you know, in the 3.5 years that it took us to make the film, her relevance really only seemed to grow, and the public interest in her only got kind of more intense.
What made you initially want to make a movie about Ruth Bader Ginsburg?
Yeah, so, you know, in January 2015, we were just noticing how much, the millennial generation seemed to be obsessed. Liberal millennials were so into this octogenarian, quiet, soft-spoken, intellectual grandmother that seemed like an interesting phenomenon. I had actually interviewed Justice Ginsburg before for my film The Sturgeon Queens, and a friend of mine, another documentary filmmaker, Betsy West, had also interviewed Justice Ginsburg for a project she did called Makers, kind of telling the whole story of the women's rights movement. And we just said, you know, someone ought to sit down and do a full documentary just about Justice Ginsburg. She's so interesting. We knew her backstory. We knew how much she had done to ensure legal rights for women under the Constitution. You know, she's got this amazing story going all the way back to her own days as a Harvard Law School undergraduate, as a Harvard Law School student in the 50s, all the way through the 60s and 70s. Like, there was so much cool stuff that she'd done that even some of her fans, the people that are putting her face on T-shirts and tote bags and even, God forbid, tattoos, like, there's so much about her that we felt like people really didn't know. And we just thought her whole life was just deserving of its own documentary. So let's try to make this film.
Well, I have to say that I learned so much about her life from watching your movie. I was aware of her, but I was not aware of the cult following that she has, the inspiring person that she is to so many millions of people. You cover a lot of ground in this movie. Let's go back to some of the early days. I had no idea that her parents never went to college, but they really did inspire her in many ways, particularly her mom. There's a quote that is mentioned in the film that her mom said to Ruth at a young age, and she said, "Be a lady, be independent." And it seems like these were very influential words. What did this quote mean to her? Yeah,
you know, Justice Ginsburg, or Ruth Bader Ginsburg at the time, was extremely close to her mother, who sadly got cancer when young Ruth Bader was in the high school only, you know, when she was young, and passed away just before Ruth Bader graduated from high school. And her mother, you know, kind of obviously was not living in a generation where a woman was given a lot of opportunity to fulfill her career dreams, and yet her mother cared so much about education and books and reading, and, you know, brought young Ruth to the library kind of all the time and exposed her to music and theater and all these things that became so important in Ruth Bader and Ginsburg's life. And her mother just had some life lessons for her that young Ruth really listened to. And one of them was, don't get yourself all absorbed in what she considered useless emotions. A key one of those being anger. You know, when someone mistreats you or when you're not getting what you deserve, instead of getting angry, you know, take some action and see what you can do to change things. And the other was, and this was kind of an unusual thing to be telling a girl back in the 1930s and 40s, was to be independent. Like, it's great if you find Prince Charming. It's great if you find a man who can provide for you, but you should also always be prepared to fend for yourself. And those were lessons that Ruth Bader really, really took to heart and kind of carried with her whole life. I mean, I actually think it's an interesting influence that her mother died as young as she did, because I feel like her words may have carried more weight. You know, sometimes when you're a teenager with healthy parents, you might just dismiss some of what they say. But, you know, Ruth was so close to her mother, and she was getting this advice at the time that was basically, you know, dying wisdom, and she listened, and she just carried these things through and really lived them out.
You also spend a great deal of time in the movie touching on the relationship in her life, her eventual husband, Marty. And one of the things that I thought was so inspiring was when she comments that the thing that she really liked about him, out of many things, was that he respected her for her mind. And I have 3 daughters, and that's something you just don't hear all the time today in our culture that's so obsessed with looks and beauty and all that kind of stuff. To hear that even back then she was interested in finding someone who appreciated her mind, that was quite remarkable.
Right, and by her own accounting, that wasn't so easy to find. You know, Ruth Bader and Marty Ginsburg met each other at Cornell when they were both students there. He was 18, she was 17. They were a year apart in school as well. From the home movies that we include in our film that had never been shown publicly anywhere before, you can see she was an extraordinarily beautiful young woman.
Yeah.
And on top of that, Cornell, like most colleges at that point, the male-female ratio was very stilted. It was 4 guys for every girl. So she was going to have her pick of men, and as she describes it in the film, she never did her whole freshman year, she never did a repeat date. Like, every night was a different guy because she had so many options. Finally, she meets Marty and says, like, this is the first guy that cared that she had a brain. Now, interestingly, by Marty's description, because, you know, he's passed away now, but we have a lot of videotaped talks that he gave over time, and his description, although he absolutely acknowledges how smart she was, he remembers pretty well, although supposedly they were being set up on a blind date. He had cheated, and he had someone point out to him who she was, and his reaction was, oh my God, she's so beautiful. And then he said he spent some time with her and thought, like, wow, she's really smart too. And the beautiful thing about him was how much he cared about that and respected it. And even while he was an extremely successful tax lawyer in his own right, he just had this thought that, like, he kind of saw her. He saw who she was. He got pretty early on, even at a time when, like, the thought that, like, a man wouldn't be thinking, oh, his wife might be, like, a superstar lawyer, like when they were at Harvard Law School together. He was telling everyone, like, my wife's going to make law review. He could just kind of tell how smart she was.
Wow.
And then going on, you know, skipping later in her career as she had the opportunity to become a federal judge and ultimately a Supreme Court justice, he just felt like she deserved this. And he was instrumental in getting her considered to be on the Supreme Court because, you know, she's shy and quiet. He's this incredibly gregarious connector kind of guy who just knew everyone in Washington in the early 90s. And he was just like, you know, damn it, my wife deserves to be a Supreme Court justice, and I want to do everything I can to make that possible, even when it meant, moving from New York to D.C. for her job as a federal judge. This was at a time it's not that, Marty Ginsburg would be a progressive husband by today's standards.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing to imagine going back to the 50s and 60s, a guy who's willing to say, well, actually my wife's career comes first, even if it means I have to do more work taking care of the kids, even if it means I'm doing all the cooking. That's how it should be, because she deserves it. That's just how he saw it.
It is pretty remarkable, especially due to the fact that he had his own very, very successful career. So it was a bit of a sacrifice on his part. The thing that I really learned so much about, which I didn't know, is how important her work was as a lawyer before she became well known. You bring up so many interesting things, through the course of her life, about the mistreatment of women in America, that it's pretty remarkable. Can you talk a little bit about the inequality at Harvard that she learned about, and also after she got out of Harvard, some of the laws that were still on the books in America that she couldn't believe were still the reality at the time?
Yeah, certainly there's been so much renewed focus on how women are treated in society. That's become an even bigger issue, just even in the course of while we were getting ready for this film to be released. But what people sometimes forget is we're not that many decades past a period where it was acceptable and completely illegal to mistreat women or to treat them unfairly compared to men. A wife often couldn't take out a mortgage or get a credit card without her husband signing off on that. You could be fired for getting pregnant.
That's amazing.
Men, just as a general rule, were not prosecuted for raping. Husbands weren't prosecuted for raping their wives. It was considered that that was sort of like a man's prerogative. And this stuff was just how it was, and was part of the law. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg showed up in law school, it wasn't really. It wasn't really presumed that she even had the right to be there. I mean, she describes going with the 9 women in her class of the total class of 500 people. The 9 women went to dinner at the dean's house, and everything's nice and friendly. And then he goes around asking the women one by one, why are you taking up the place that could be held by a man? Interestingly, since we made the movie, I've read a number of accounts of different women at all different law schools of that era who were basically asked the same question just regularly. That was what you guys were like, why are you, you don't even have a right to be here, was kind of a presumption. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was one of a number of kind of budding professional women who saw this was unfair. What was different about her was going back to her mom's whole thing of don't get angry, figure out how you can change things. She decided that she was going to take this on as an issue in her legal career. She was teaching at Rutgers Law School, and her students, this is now, the 60s, and women are starting the women's liberation movement, and a bunch of her students said, let's have a class about, women's rights in the law. And she went to the law library, and she started reading books what have been the cases about this? And she saw that there was very little. And she just decided, I'm going to take this on as an issue. She, in the course of the 70s, she, working for the ACLU, for a branch that they created called the Women's Rights Project, she argued 6 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court as a lawyer, won 5 of them, and those cases began to lay the groundwork for the idea that under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, women need to be considered equally with men, and vice versa. She took cases, she took a case for a young woman who was an Air Force lieutenant who discovered that she didn't get the same housing benefits as a married woman that a married man would get. And, Ruth Bader Ginsburg took that case and argued it before the Supreme Court. There was a man who discovered that when his wife passed away, that he couldn't get the same Social Security benefits as a widow would get because it's presumed like the male should be a breadwinner. He shouldn't stay home and get benefits and like raise his baby. His wife had died in childbirth. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg took that case to the Supreme Court, won both those cases, starting to lay out a groundwork like, no, the Constitution should protect this idea of equal rights for men and women under the law. It seems, today it seems, to me at least, kind of rather obvious. Like, yes, of course there should be equal rights for men and women under our law. At the time that she was raising these ideas, she wasn't the first to have the idea, but this was considered a very radical idea in the early 1970s when she started arguing these cases.
What I didn't quite understand, which you really illustrate so clearly in the movie, is that that she had like a long-term vision, that she understood that like each case was a step towards a larger goal, and that it was almost like a game of chess, that like you had to do all these different moves to get to where you wanted to go, and to have that vision was really remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, she's a very unusual person in what a strategic thinker she is and how patient she is. And she just realized you don't want to jump, you don't want to jump ahead of things. You want to take cases that she thought that the 9 at the time male justices of the Supreme Court might be able to, be swayed to her way of thinking. And she knew that it was going to take decades to achieve this, but she just wanted to do it one step at a time. Now, she makes the point herself that it was actually a strategy that she borrowed from another fantastic lawyer who then became a Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall, who, when he was arguing I would probably say even most of the key civil rights cases before the Supreme Court in the 1950s and 60s, took a pretty similar approach. Like, Rome wasn't built in a day, like step by step, I'm going to move the court's position from where it has been to an understanding about the way that the Constitution in general, and particularly the 14th Amendment, protects equal rights. Thurgood Marshall was making the argument about equal rights for blacks and whites, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg made the same argument about equal rights for women and men.
Julie, this show is called The Sounds of Film, and we play a lot of soundtrack music on the program. And I thought initially we would just be talking about, the issues related to her career. But this is a rich movie. You really get into personal aspects about her life, and music is a big part. Can you talk both about the Notorious B.I.G. connection to the title of your film, and then also her love of opera, which is a big part of this movie?
Absolutely, yes. I was thinking that it's good to be on a program called The Sound of Film, because yes, sound and music are very important to our story, and even more important to Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself, who would tell you flat out, if you ask, like, was her dream to be a Supreme Court justice, this great exalted thing, and she would tell you no, like, if she could be anything, she would be a great opera diva. She just doesn't have the singing voice to carry that off. She absolutely adores opera and all classical music, and is a big fan of the arts generally. Basically, when she's not working on an opinion or dissent, you can often find her at the theater, or most often at the opera, which she loves. And we had the opportunity to join her at the opera several times, including on an occasion where she's performing in a speaking role as the Duchess of Krakenthorpe in a great opera called Daughter of the Regiment. In a sort of a different musical aspect of the film, we do have some more hip-hop type music, because Ruth Bader Ginsburg, initials RBG, and generally known, and she does sign letters RBG, and has for some time. And a few years ago, as her dissents were starting to get noticed among young women, and particularly young women law students, someone made the very clever connection, calling her the Notorious RBG, of course, a reference to the Notorious B.I.G.
Right.
And you might think, okay, that's a little bit of a stretch. These two characters are quite different. But when she's asked about it, the Justice has a great line, which is like, no, I like being compared to the notorious B.I.G. We actually have a lot in common. We were both born and bred in Brooklyn, New York.
That's
it
true.
is always a surefire applause line. I'll say that when the Justice saw our film for the first time, and she actually didn't see the film in advance of it getting out to the public. Her first time seeing it was at our world premiere at Sundance in January, and her first comment, even during the film and then right after, was like, "Oh, I just love the music so much." Now, we didn't ask to clarify whether she meant the opera or the hip hop, but we're assuming she was referring to the opera music.
That's great. And, you know, the last thing I wanted to ask you about was that you point out at the end of the movie that when the court became more conservative, there were more and more times where she would have to write the dissenting opinion. What I didn't realize, though, was that there were so many people out there waiting to hear what she had to say. And that these words of hers became very important to so many people, even sometimes on a case that didn't go the way that she wanted. And, you know, that was informative to me, that even on a case that may not go the way that she wants, you can still have a very big impact on the country. Can you explain that a little bit to our listeners?
Absolutely. So the way Supreme Court decisions work is that, you know, the justices, a majority of the justices come up with what is the majority opinion, the majority ruling, and one in the majority will write that. And then, but justices who disagree have the option to write a dissent. That's been part of the system for many years. And in fact, sometimes when a case is overturned many years later, the writers of the new majority will rely on the wording from a previous dissent. So a dissent can be a very powerful thing, not just in terms of public opinion, but also sometimes dissents become the law of the land. So, you know, a justice wants to come up with an argument that's very strong. Now, Justice Ginsburg has done something that's a little bit specific in terms of how she handles dissents, because, and part of the reason her dissents have gotten so much attention in recent years, there's kind of two reasons. One is that she, on occasion, will take the opportunity, which isn't the usual thing, but is like if you feel really strongly and want to do something publicly, to read her dissent from the bench. So it's not like you're just filing paper. You're going ahead and reading sort of a summarized version of what you have to say out loud. So that becomes kind of part of the conversation. And what happens in the court is audio tape. So sometimes that audio gets out. You'll hear a lot of it in our film. But also, you know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is at heart a teacher. She's a lawyer and a judge, but like teaching is really important to her. She was a law professor for many years, and we've seen her do all kinds of public speaking, and she really seems to enjoy teaching. And she has a way of writing a dissent when she's writing it in very non-lawyery language. She's kind of trying to write something that people who aren't Supreme Court insiders and aren't lawyers will understand, and use language that's going to resonate with people, trying to send a message. You know, when you're writing a dissent, you're saying, like, I think what the court is doing is wrong and isn't the correct interpretation of the law, and here's why. So that can be a pretty powerful message, and some of her dissents, which have used not, you know, others, you know, her close friend Justice Scalia often used quite pointed and harsh language, insulting those who had written the majority opinion, and basically saying, I don't want to get the example wrong, but he once said something about like the thoughts of the majority are sort of like mushy, like applesauce or something. He tended to kind of insult his opponents. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is a little bit less on the dissing and a little bit more on the, you know, just like a really good line or a really good analogy when an opinion was coming out to somewhat dismantle the voting rights Act and to take away some of the protections of making sure that minority voters have full access to the polls on the logic that things have changed enough in our country that such things wouldn't be necessary anymore. Her great line from that was, it's like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet.
Wow.
Like a good punchy line that you don't have to be a lawyer to understand what she's saying there, and it just really caught on, and people started sharing that, and it brought a whole generation of people into thinking more about the Supreme Court and what it does and why it's important, and in the case where she's dissenting, like some thoughts about like maybe where the court is going in a direction that people should be paying attention to because it's a problem in her view and in the view of a lot of her supporters.
Well, Julie, we talked about at the beginning of this interview that this is the #1 film in Magnolia Pictures history, and you must be so thrilled. Like, what are you feeling at this point? Because I mean, she accomplished so much, but now you have had the opportunity to share her story with so many people, and for a lot of people, this movie will be it. You know, there's some people that don't go beyond watching films. What are you feeling now that the newspapers, the media, are talking about this film as being the success that it is?
Yes, well, it's certainly been fun. I mean, I think the most exciting thing for the film team is being in theaters with people that are having the experience of watching it and just seeing how people react to it. I mean, you know, documentaries, by reputation anyway, I think things are changing in a lot of ways, not just our film, but documentaries sometimes have a reputation for being like a little dry, a little boring, a little bit like take your medicine.
Right.
We feel like we made a movie that's really, really fun to watch. Like, yes, you're going to learn some things. I'm not going to lie to you. You might come away having learned a thing or two, but even more so, it's just sort of like an emotional experience. A lot of it's really funny. A lot of it's really romantic. Some of it, we hope, is inspiring. And the whole idea that people are coming to the theater, sometimes you've got people coming up dressed like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You know, people are coming to the theater and enjoying themselves and feeling a real connection to a person. Like, you know, look, our celebrities in this country are usually musicians and athletes. And, like, I've got nothing against either musicians nor athletes. Many of them are admirably talented. But the whole idea of people getting really excited about an 85-year-old who's made a name for herself primarily by being really, really smart, that seems pretty cool.
Well, you deserve a lot of credit for that, because her story is remarkable, but you know, if the documentary was made by someone else, you know, it might not have gotten on the screen the way that you did it, and you're the one who deserves some credit for making people so excited about her life. Congratulations.
Well, thank you very, very much. I appreciate it.
So if people want to learn a little bit more about your movie, RBG, is there a website or anything like that?
Absolutely, rbgmovie.com.
Well, I want to recommend to everyone that you try to go see a screening and check out any place that you can to see this movie. It's important, it's entertaining, it's a lot of fun. And Julie, I'd love to have you on again sometime to talk about some of your other films and your work. But congratulations, this is just a great movie, RBJ. And again, I recommend it to all of our listeners. Thanks, Julie.
Okay, thanks so much, Tom.
Good night.